I'll start by reading the intro, because I think that the introduction is extraordinarily powerful, and it conveys in, I think, the deepest and simplest ways what Nemonte wanted and what her father and her people wanted with this exercise in writing down her story, which typically is a story that's just told over the fire in the longhouse. Walk down the trail, then veer off into forest, leaving no tracks. This was my father's counsel when I told him that I would be telling my story to you. I knew what he meant, that my ancestors would be watching, that there are stories that must remain hidden, secrets that must be guarded. Across the centuries, my people learned not to trust you. That's how we stayed alive, unconquered, leaving no tracks. For us, stories are living beings. They breathe life into our homes, into our forests. They pulse in our blood, in our dreams. They stalk us like jaguars, clack like peccary, sail like macaws, run like fish. And they're powerful beings. Like rainbows, they bring peace. Like lightning, they bring war. And they're always changing. That's how we know that they are alive. A story dies when no one tells it. Our stories have never been written down, not like this. Part of me is scared. Have I told too much? Left too many tracks? What will you do with my story now that it has been written? I hope you will let it live. So that's the introduction to our book, We Will Be Jaguars. And this book had a different title originally. It was published in the UK, and this was published last year in the UK, and the title was We Will Not Be Saved. And then in the US, the title changed to We Will Be Jaguars. It was published now in 10 languages, and in each language, we've realized that the authors start losing control of the title. So in French, it's called La Voix des Jaguars. It's the voice of the jaguar. In Dutch and German, it's the daughter of the Amazon. So the book has many different titles, but we fought hard to make sure that to be able to have control over the translation and be able to review the translation. So that's been tremendous effort, and also to make sure they didn't cut anything, because in French and German, the languages are like 30 to 40% longer, so the book's, like a 550-page book now. But I say all that to say that the story is traveling. It has wings. The people that find the book are moved by it. And it's been the deepest and one of the most greatest, I think, honors and pleasures of our life, to be able to meet people who've spent 10, 13, 15, 20 hours, reading or listening to Nemonte's story, letting her story take you all downriver, entering into a world that is unfamiliar. We did our best to try to maintain the integrity of that world, and the reality of that world, and the complexity of that world, but also create a bridge to the rest of the world of understanding. And I think, when I've never done this on my own. I've never had a book talk on my own. It's always either Nemonte is going on her own, traveling around the world and doing these talks, or I accompany her, and we're a pretty powerful team. So this is the first time I've done this on my own. So I know what Nemonte says in these spaces. And I think for what she always says is that for her, the root of everything, the root of all of the threats, all of the destruction, all of the systemic pressures on natural systems, ecosystems, cultures, our planet, deep down stems from a spiritual crisis. Deep down stems from civilizations that little by little over generations are losing connection to the earth, to living systems, to our relatives. And she hopes that this book brings people closer to their own spirituality, to their own sense of connection and place on this planet. And in doing so, helps people realize the idea of community, the sense of being together in a shared struggle and in a shared purpose on this planet. Something that I've noticed, having grown up in California and in living in indigenous cultures for decades, that individualism and the life in sort of Western democracies and Western industrial civilization does tend towards isolation and individualism, and it is a really strong, you need a really strong and intentional struggle to maintain connection with the earth and connection with community. And then another dream of this book is to find people that want to join us in our struggle to lift up indigenous cultures, indigenous guardianship, and the protection of the Amazon rainforest and our planet's climate. The Amazon sustains life on Earth. It's the largest terrestrial carbon sink beyond the oceans. It's doing more for our climate than most other ecosystems on the planet. And it is facing a catastrophic tipping point. So, for decades, you guys have heard about, the rates of deforestation in Brazil and how many soccer pitches a minute are being destroyed, and well, that's ongoing. And the Brazilian Amazon makes up one of the largest percentage of the Amazon rainforest. It's the entire eastern basin, essentially. And the Brazilian Amazon is literally less than a decade away from an irreversible climate tipping point, which means that the Brazilian Amazon will lose its ability to produce its own rainfall. And that leads to a vicious cycle or of negative feedback loops, where it stops producing sufficient rain, leading to more dried forests, which lead to farmers, it's time to burn. This is time to burn, and then wildfires or man-made fires, which then leads to less capacity to produce rain. And eventually that leads to what's called the savanization of the rainforest. So within, 60 to 70 years, the entire eastern part of the basin could turn into savanna. What that means is indigenous cultures, over 400 indigenous nations who rely on the rainforests for their spiritual sustenance, their economic sustenance, their social sustenance, their life, will lose that ability to survive and sustain life. All of the not only charismatic wildlife and animals of the forest, like the jaguars and the tapirs and the woolly monkeys and the macaws, will lose their home, and we'll begin seeing new levels of extinction crisis. But all of the plants, biodiversity that the Amazon rainforest has been creating over hundreds of millions of years, it's been essentially an evolutionary laboratory miracle of yet to be discovered medicines, cures for cancer, diabetes, new creams for anti-aging creams. Will be lost. Our organization and Nemonte's people are living in the upper Amazon. And And the upper Amazon is also called the headwaters. And so if you guys can picture that you're flying over the Amazon and you're looking down on it, imagine a great big trunk, a huge tree trunk that goes from the Atlantic Ocean all the way west. Huge tree trunk. That's the Amazon River. Yeah. And then imagine at the western part of the Amazon, this huge, beautiful canopy, branches. You know, that's the upper Amazon. That is from where the Andes Range is. It cuts from south to north across the Andes Ranges. There are hundreds of thousands of creeks and rivers that all pour down over rocks and huge boulders, stones, and they all flush down into what's called the headwaters. And little by little, they all begin merging into the big tributaries of the great big Amazon. And it's a huge dispute across Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil where the Amazon River actually begins. Most people say that it begins in the Peruvian Amazon in Iquitos, where a number of the great big rivers merge. But the area where we're working is the upper Amazon. Imagine waterfalls, imagine huge polished boulders and stones like prehistoric dinosaur eggs. Imagine a lush, misty cloud forest. And imagine indigenous cultures that have been living there for thousands of years, and over the last 500 years have had to weather a tremendous assault on their cultures and their way of life since the arrival of the Spaniards. The communities that are still, the cultures that have survived to this day, have survived military incursion, the search for El Dorado. They've survived multiple waves of epidemics and diseases, from measles to yellow fever to the common cold. They survived the rubber boom. So rubber was discovered in the late 1800s, and it was, fueled the war effort essentially in World War I. Huge rubber plantations all across the Amazon, and indigenous peoples were enslaved to essentially make tires for us in the U.S. and in Europe. And then eventually gold mining, logging for hardwoods, oil, all of this pressure coming from outside. This story, and Nemonte's story, and her people's story, it ends and begins in some way in the 1950s. We didn't make an anthropological or historical book. This was a memoir, and Nemonte wanted to immerse people into her life, into her journey as a young child, and how she saw the world from her eyes, and how she grew into a leader of her people. But her people are the Guarani people. They're one of the last indigenous tribes of the Upper Amazon to be contacted or to be conquered by outside forces or by Western civilization. They survived living a traditional subsistence hunter-harvesting lifestyle into the 1950s. They were famous, even known by the Incan people as fierce warriors. So before the arrival of the Spaniards, the Incans were even like, hey, you can't go in to these people's land, they're gonna spear you. They were amazing tree climbers, amazing hunters. They're one of the tribes that discovered curare, which is dark poison that eventually was discovered by Western scientists and doctors and is the core ingredient in certain muscle relaxants that are used in anesthesia and in surgeries around the world. So curare was then synthetically turned into an important anesthesia for surgeries that pretty much every one of us has used. The Warani discovered that along with other tribes simultaneously in different parts of the Amazon. But they were a tribe that lived in the mountainous sort of backwoods. They didn't live along the big rivers of the Amazon. They liked to live up on the high perches, high ground. They would go down into the creeks and carry up on their ceramic pots, carry back up to the ridge lines. They didn't like to leave any tracks. They were amazing at imitating people, observing. They were fierce warriors. They healed themselves through their connections with medicine, spirituality, and they didn't want to dialogue with anyone coming into their territory. So if people came into their territory, generally they would spear them. So today they have an area that's larger than the size of Yellowstone National Park. It's about 2.5 million acres of some of the most biodiverse forests. Traditionally, their territory was even bigger. But they were able to remain uncontacted because of their geographic location, because of their culture as warriors, and because most of the indigenous tribes that lived along the big rivers were decimated over decades or centuries by disease, by military invasion, enslaved by the rubber tappers. So in the 1950s, American evangelical missionaries, and most of this is told little by little in the book, were on a mission to translate indigenous languages, to translate the Bible into every language on the planet. Every language that God's creations spoke, their mission was to translate the Bible. Initially that was called the Wycliffe Bible Translators, later turned into the Summer Institute of Linguistics. But over 50 years, they developed fairly savvy, very smart strategy to contact remote indigenous populations and win trust and ultimately learn their language, translate the Bible, and bring sort of the lost sheep of God's herd into civilization, into God's glory, into God's love. And I'm saying this is in their words. And so in the 1950s, one way of life of Nemonte's people ends, and another way of life begins. The American evangelical missionaries, there were 5 missionary men, all with wives and families, that covertly had been planning to contact who they called the Auca people. The Aucas is a Quechua name for the Warani, which means the savage ones. And there was one pilot named Nate Saint, real last name, who was a very inventive, very genius inventor and a fervent missionary. And he developed what's called the spiral line technique. So he basically learned that if you fly a single-engine Cessna plane in a perfect circle, you could drop down a line at the end in a conical format, and it would not move. It would stay completely motionless, and you could attach a basket to that, and you could give gifts to indigenous peoples in the forest by flying in a complete circle. And so over about a year, he would fly over these Auca Warani houses, Nemonte's grandparents, and he would give pots and pans and machetes and sometimes chicken, salt, sugar. And little by little, the Warani began putting like scarlet macaws or toucans or parrots back in, and he was writing about this all in his diaries and his journals, saying we've made contact, we've made friendship, we've made the first exchange between this savage people and God's love and God's glory. And these 5 American missionary men decided that in the winter of 1995, Christmas 1955, decided to camp out on one of these beaches in the Waorani people's territory. And they were speared to death, all 5 of them. And it's a long story as to why they were speared to death. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of miscommunication, but they essentially had inserted themselves into a clanic structure that was upsetting the dynamic of power within the clan. So one of the young warriors was the first to make contact with these 5 missionaries, and they began flying him around in the sky. He would go back to the longhouse at night and say that now he's the chief because he flies with the white men, and so then the other warriors said, no. And so we're gonna get rid of these white guys so you can stay in your role, stay in your place. And one of the sisters of Nate Saint, the pilot, is named Rachel Saint. And you guys read the book. Rachel Saint ultimately becomes essentially the queen and the leader, the ruler of the Waorani people. But Rachel made it her life's mission to learn the language, to contact and civilize the Waorani people. And Nemonte's family, her father was only about 10 years old, a naked Waorani youth that walked, for 20 days through the forest to go to see the missionaries and watch as his people all contracted polio. And 80% of his clan died within the first several months. That began the sort of story of the Waorani people's, the last 50 years of their life, sort of dealing with several waves of colonization and conquest. The first, the evangelical missionaries who ruled their lives and made the Waorani people, whole generations fearful of the forest, fearful of their own dreams, fearful of traditional medicines. And then when Rachel Saint died, she made a deal with the oil companies, who were also run by evangelical missionaries at the time. And they concessioned off the Waorani people's land in the 1990s when Nemonte was about 8 years old or 9 years old, to Maxis Oil. And so that's when this book begins. I'm gonna read a short.
Is it originally written in Spanish or English?
I wrote the book in English, but I listened to it in Huautedelo. I listened to Nemonte tell her story in her language, Huautedelo, which I understand and speak a little of, and in Spanish. But because English is my language, I wrote it in English and then we translated it into the other languages. Yeah.
Which version do you think has captured the spirit?
Personally, I think the English version. Personally, I think the English version. We're working with Nemonte's brother, Opie, who was actually just elected